Welcome to PostScript, the video interview series of Philippine Studies, historical and ethnographic viewpoints, where we talk with authors of previously published articles in the journal. For our second PostScript interview, the journal is delighted to have Resil Mojares, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of San Carlos and a member of the editorial board of Philippine Studies. Just recently, the journal held an international conference in honor of his life and works. He has done extensive research on 19th and early 20th century Filipino intellectuals. Among his publications on this topic are Brains of the Nation, Pedro Paterno, T.H. Padre de Vera, Isabel de los Reyes, and the Production of Modern Knowledge, a book published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2006, and an article in Philippine Studies in 2010 titled Guillermo Tolentino's Grupo de Filipinos Ilustres and the Making of a National Pantheon. Professor Mojares, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for PostScript. We are honored to have you here. First of all, can you describe to us the historical context and significance of Guillermo Tolentino's Grupo de Filipinos Ilustres?
Tolentino's work, which kind of he titled Grupo de Filipinos Ilustres, is probably the most popular kind of collective portrait of the nation's heroes. And I think it remains popular even until today. I can't think of any other portrait of its kind that is as popular. So this was done in 1911, and originally originally submitted to a Tagalog periodical, but the publisher suggested that it should be put out as a poster. So, and Tolentino himself, that he was gratified by the fact that in many homes, they had a portrait framed and displayed. And actually there was some initial print run of 1,500, but eventually other editions were produced. And in fact, interesting with respect to the changing political climate, that some later editions make changes, like some of the persons displayed are taken out, and new ones added, and so on. But the point is that it's interesting as one illustration of the great interest at the beginning of the 20th century for nation building, and part of that effort was, the creation and popularization of national symbols, national heroes, and so on. So early 20th century is a very interesting time, because that was when there was a great deal of interest in constructing or defining a national theater, a national language. So the portrait is part of that context.
So what made this specific artwork so popular? As you mentioned, 1,500 copies were sold in its original print run. Can we say that there was this art-consuming public at that time?
I don't think, although that's part of its popularity, because Guillermo Tolentino although this was a very early work of his, eventually became the country's leading sculptor. Mm-hmm. The sculpture was really his main form, rather than painting. But I think it's more the interest in national symbols that underlies the popularity of the portrait, because I don't think there's a portrait of this kind that's it is more popular than this one. No? So it's just has to do with the interest at the time in kind of nationalizing moves, in a sense, kind of the early 20th century. So I think that's the principal explanation. Yeah.
What details did you find most interesting, most intriguing? You mentioned earlier some of them were, some of the figures in the first copy were removed eventually?
Yeah, the first point of interest for me actually was like, why this particular group of people? You know, we kind of, I think that's the first question that you ask. And then discovering, after kind of thought about who's included in the portrait, because in a sense that's the kind of the politically kind of sensitive subject. Who's excluded? Who's included? And so I think Tolentino himself said that this is a composite of kind of the way he constructed it. Kind of he looked at photographs, or which probably mostly which appeared in print, of these individuals, and can just put them together, no? Because obviously, kind of, in fact, the characters here kind of do not occupy the same space or time. So he took out individual portraits and then put them together into this group photo. And I realized that one reason why this, like for instance, you wonder, why is Clemente Solweta there? He was important at that particular time, but kind of is somebody now we don't quite remember. And also Clemente Solweta really died very young. And so why Clemente Solweta? And the only explanation was that Clemente Solweta was kind of much talked about at that particular time. He died in 1911. Or like why Antonio Regidor, because kind of his image is kind of high ilustrado, kind of loyal to kind of Spain and the United States later on. And in fact, he was no longer living in the country. He was in his late career. He was living in London and so on. So why Antonio Regidor? Because Antonio Regidor also died. In fact, I think 4 or 5 of the 13 persons in the portrait died in 1910, 1911, meaning their faces were probably kind of readily available in the press. So, because that's kind of in selected, it's also a matter of availability of the portraits to be able to execute it. And it was done like 1911, and those faces were, so, which kind of in a sense illustrates the contingency of a canon, no? Because kind of here's a canon of national heroes. And often kind of why this person is part of it, kind of maybe more circumstantial than anything else. So that's kind of, I think, the first point of interest for me. And of course, I was thinking of now, kind of in a sense, how, for instance, what you expect of a canon is that it kind of attempts to be inclusive, no? And so you think about who's excluded here, who's included. So I think there's a certain attempt at a certain inclusiveness, because you have military men like Malvar, Antonio Luna, you have kind of high intellectuals like Pedro Paterno, kind of presenting an image, because after all, the intent of an image like this is to present like the Filipino nation as a unified community, as a collectivity. So and in that process, you gloss over kind of the differences, the divisions, the fissures within society. so that it makes for a strange portrait, because probably in real life you would not expect Malvar standing beside Antonio Regidor or Pedro Paterno together with Antonio Luna. But you have to create the fiction that the nation is one and whole. Right? So, and paper over or gloss over the fact that in fact society is highly factionalized. So, kind of, because the group portrait is intended to be kind of to serve pedagogical and patriotic ends, kind of communicating that the Filipino nation is kind of one and whole. Now, when the reality, of course, is much more complicated.